Well, thank you all for being here. This is the second of our great book series. A couple of weeks ago, Jordan did a great job with Pride and Prejudice. Tonight, we're going to be considering Les Miserables by Victor Hugo. Hugo was born on February 26, 1802, in Besson, France. His father was a general in Napoleon's army. His mother was a devout royalist and Catholic, instilling in Hugo an early tension between secularism and faith. And we find this in many of his works, such as The Hunchback of Notre Dame. He never wholeheartedly turned against religion, but on the other hand, he always did have a bit of a critical eye towards the established church. His writing often reflected social justice, human rights, and the plight of the poor. He was a passionate advocate for republicanism and an opponent of the death penalty. He lived in exile during the reign of Napoleon III, which was 1851 to 1870, where much of Les Miserables was written. He lived in the Channel Islands. He lived in Guernsey, just outside of France under the protection of the British. He returned to France after the fall of Napoleon III and was celebrated as a national hero. His writings, especially Les Miserables, his writings were so widely circulated that during the American Civil War, the soldiers on both sides were waiting for the next installment because, of course, it was written, as many novels were at that time, in a serial form. And in the South, they referred to themselves as Lee's Miserables. He died on May 22nd, 1885, and was given a national funeral reflecting his immense influence on French culture. Well, let's consider some of the key characters of this novel. And I do want to highlight, many of you have seen adaptations, especially the stage production, the Broadway touring company and on Broadway. Something that I find very intriguing, the Broadway production really is very, very faithful to the book, which, considering the size of the book, is quite a feat. The main character is Jean Valjean. We're going to be looking at him in some detail. He's a man who was imprisoned legally but tragically for stealing a loaf of bread to feed his sister's starving family, and was imprisoned for 19 years. And this is the framework in which the story begins. Then there is Inspector Javert. He is a man who comes from a very rough background. He was from the lower classes and essentially pulled himself up by his bootstraps, and his guiding light was legal, meticulous following, the idea being that the law cannot be bent in any way, and he represents the law with no mercy. We then have Fantine. She is a woman who finds herself in a bad situation. She's an unwed mother. Her lover, the father of her child, essentially used her as a fling and then abandoned her. And so her life from that time on is finding a way to provide for her daughter Cosette. And as an unwed mother, she puts Cosette into the care of others and pays for her upkeep first as a factory worker, but then losing her job at the factory when it was found out that she had a child out of wedlock, which at that point in time was a scandal. She was branded as a woman of loose morals. She then, because of that, descends into a life of prostitution. She ends up selling both her hair and her teeth in order to get money to provide for Cosette's care. Cosette will eventually, as she grows into being a young lady, have a romantic interest with Marius Pontmercy. Marius is from a well-to-do family, a royalist family, but he embraces Republican ideals and it's more of a dalliance. It's a sort of a hobby of university students to be involved in these. Eponine is the daughter of the innkeepers who were taking care of Cosette. She is the same age as Cosette. They were girls together growing up. She also is involved with Marius, but Marius had no interest in her. And she represents unrequited love, and indeed, she will lose her life in the course of this. Her parents, the Thénardiers, in the stage, now this is one point where the stage production is a bit off from the book, and that is in the stage production, the Thénardiers are comic relief. But they are indeed rascals. In the book, there is no comic relief with it. They are just rascals. And then a figure that is so important, but only appears briefly, Bishop Myriel. He is the one who truly causes a transformation in the life of Jean Valjean. So let's go through a synopsis of the story. Jean Valjean is introduced as a man condemned to 19 years of hard labor for stealing a loaf of bread to feed his sister's starving children. Now, with both Jean Valjean and then with Fantine, we find individuals who make mistakes, but the mistakes are framed in such a way that they're understandable. With Fantine, the idea of being blinded by the love of the man, and with Jean Valjean, the desperation of his family, his sister's children are starving. He's got to do something, but he does break the law. But the disproportionate sentence, 19 years hard labor for doing this. Upon his release, Valjean is given a yellow passport. Now, we are not at all accustomed to this in our country. The idea that you have to have papers, that you have to be able to prove who you are at any point in time. We recoil from that idea, but in Europe, it was very much the case that people were expected to have papers, and their papers would be checked. Whenever you would go into a city, there might be a checkpoint, and you would have to show who you were. Well, as a criminal, his passport, his papers were yellow, and it marked him as an ex-convict, which made it almost impossible to find work or to find some place to stay, to find a boarding house that would take him in. The idea that if he could get work, that he would not be paid adequately because they could pay him less because, well, he's a convict. He's not going to make as much as someone who doesn't have that on his record. He then comes into the town of Dain, and Bishop Myriel takes him in. Now, Bishop Mariel is shown to be a man who has given his life over to helping the poor. He's very kind hearted. But the bishop has one thing that weighs on his conscience. It's just always bothering him. Of course, as a bishop, when he enters into this office, he will inherit from his predecessor everything that comes with that office. So he'll have a nice home, but there was nice silverware. And the bishop, he had a problem in that he felt guilty for liking having the silverware. It's finery, and he's enjoying this finery, and it really bothers him. It weighs on him. Well, Jean Valjean receives food and shelter, but he steals the bishop's silverware and flees. Well, he's apprehended. And being apprehended, he, trying to get out of the fix, claims, well, this was a gift. You know, the bishop's a very generous man. And of course, the people didn't believe it, but the bishop confirms the story. He says, yes, I gave this to him. And you know what? He left behind silver candlesticks that were also part of the gift. And he gave it all to him. And then he makes a point to Jean Valjean that he, the bishop, is now free from the burden of having this silver. But now Jean Valjean is under an obligation. He must use this newfound wealth to make something of himself. This act of grace deeply moves Valjean, and it is a point of transformation. However, Valjean breaks his parole, and he takes a new name, Monsieur Madeleine, and relocates to the town of Montreuil-sur-Mer. And he builds a factory. Now, bear in mind, this was the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution in France. The Industrial Revolution began in England and then would spread across the Channel and then throughout Europe. And so this was indeed historically accurate that in the 1830s, the Industrial Revolution was reaching France, and all at once there are all these jobs, and it was a time for a man on the make, an entrepreneur to build a factory, and he does. And he becomes not only the employer of the town, he's the mayor, which also was not at all unusual. Now, he secretly uses his wealth to assist the poor, showing his repayment of the tremendous debt that he owed to Bishop Mariel. Now, we do then come across Fantine. She's a worker in Valjean's factory, and she's dismissed. After her past as an unwed mother is revealed, she spins into poverty, is forced into prostitution to provide for her daughter Cosette, who is left in the care of the Thénardiers, their cruel innkeepers, who exploit and abuse Cosette. They use her basically as a slave. There was a slave labor going on, that Cosette would be doing all the work and would barely have enough to eat, barely be clothed adequately. It was a very bad situation. We then find Fantine arrested by Inspector Javert, who attacks a man who has insulted her, who was treating her very harshly as she was plying her trade. Valjean, as the mayor, intervenes and is able to provide amnesty for her. He takes her to a hospital and he vows to rescue Cosette. However, Fantine dies before she can see her daughter again. Now, we're brought into Javert. He's rigid and obsessed. He recognizes Valjean as the former convict, and yet there is a problem because someone else has been identified as Jean Valjean and is about to be sent to complete the sentence. And of course, if that's the case, then the mayor is off the hook. Valjean is torn between staying hidden and the idea that he's doing all this good. You know, he's providing for the poor. He's going to take care of Cosette. He's going to do, but can he let Champmathieu go to jail? And Valjean ends up confessing his true identity in court, revealing this moral struggle. He then escapes and becomes a fugitive once again. Valjean travels to the Thénardiers' inn, and discovering they've been mistreating Cosette, he pays them off and takes her into his care. And she is then, from that time on, brought up as his own daughter. They live in hiding for years in Paris, with Valjean constantly evading Javert's relentless pursuit. I mean, Inspector Javert never gave up looking for Jean Valjean. Valjean and Cosette develop a deep bond, although Valjean remains haunted by his past. They don't socialize. Even though he's a man of great wealth, and normally you would think of someone with great wealth as hosting parties and being engaged in society, not Jean Valjean. They keep to themselves. Cosette doesn't understand why, but it's because Jean Valjean is always looking over his shoulder, wondering when Inspector Javert might identify him. We then find Marius Pontmercy, a young law student who has become involved with revolutionary ideas and a group of radical friends known as the Friends of the ABC. It's a little bit of a whimsical title of this group. As I've indicated, the students, and this is something that occurred throughout the 1800s and into the 20th century, and even to this day, you find student activists very often embracing radical causes on a lark. They don't really understand what they're talking about or the intricacies of it, or sometimes they see a very narrow slice. Marius and his friends most certainly saw the plight of the underclass. Now, bear in mind, they still lived very upper class lives and enjoyed all the privileges of high society, but they could pretend and associate. They were indeed a part of, and this part of the backdrop of the novel, the storyline, is quite accurate. That in 1832, there was an uprising that was largely fueled by students trying to topple the monarchy. It did fail, as we read in the book. We find also that Marius is estranged from his royalist grandfather, who's paying all the bills, which is another underlying thing that you find. Marius falls in love with Cosette after a chance encounter, and their budding romance unfolds in secrecy because, of course, Jean Valjean has essentially forbidden Cosette to socialize with anybody. She doesn't know why, she can't quite understand it, but So Marius and Cosette have to proceed in secrecy. In 1832, Paris erupts in the June Rebellion. It was an unsuccessful uprising against the government. Marius and his friends build a barricade, hoping to spark a broader revolution. Because in their minds, they thought all of these underclass people, all of these workers would rally to them. But the thing is, most of the workers were more concerned with keeping their jobs and keeping food on the table. And they didn't want to get shot by the royalist army that would be coming against them. And so this particular revolution, this uprising, didn't get beyond the barricades, a few barricades in the city of Paris. Valjean, learning of Marius's involvement in the rebellion and his association with Cosette, infiltrates the barricade to protect him. Despite his pacifism, Valjean participates in the defense of the barricade, and during the chaos, he encounters Javert, who had been captured by the revolutionaries as a spy, and the revolutionaries had essentially held a tribunal and said, "You're a spy for the royalists, you're going to be put to death." And they give him over to the hands of Jean Valjean, assuming that Jean Valjean would do the deed. However, Valjean spares Javert's life and releases him. And we find in this that contrast between mercy and a rigid approach to the law. As the barricade falls, Valjean rescues the severely wounded Marius, and severely wounded in that Marius was completely out of it, had no idea who was saving him. Valjean carries Marius through the Parisian sewers, escaping the collapsing rebellion, and Javert is continuing to pursue him. After the failed rebellion, Javert apprehends Jean Valjean, but he's seeing Jean Valjean carrying this young man who's dying, who would die if Valjean didn't take care of him. And Jean Valjean had released Javert earlier, and Javert can't bring himself to cut short Jean Valjean's mission of mercy. And so in the end, he releases Jean Valjean, but can't deal with it, and takes his own life by jumping into the Seine. And that's just the collapse of his worldview. The center couldn't hold anymore. Marius recovers from his injuries with Valjean's care, although he is unaware that Jean Valjean is Cosette's father, or adopted father, doesn't know this. Eventually, Marius and Cosette marry, but then Jean Valjean reveals his criminal past to Marius. And Marius just can't handle this. He's shocked and repulsed. And so he essentially says, you don't deserve Cosette. You don't deserve to be her father. And so Jean Valjean retreats to solitude. He's ready to die. His life's over. But Marius eventually learns the full truth of Jean Valjean's sacrifices. Not only the sacrifices to take care of Cosette, but saving his own life, that he's the one who had carried him from the barricades where he was dying and had nursed him back to health. So Marius and Cosette rush to Valjean's side. He then dies peacefully, surrounded by love and forgiveness. having finally found redemption. Valjean's final moments emphasize the Christian themes of grace, mercy, and the power of personal transformation through love. And there are many Christian themes and understandings found in this work, most notably grace and forgiveness. Jean Valjean's transformation hinges on the grace shown by Bishop Mariel. If Mariel had not done what he did, Jean Valjean would have been sent back to prison probably for the rest of his life. You think about 19 years of hard labor for stealing a loaf of bread. What do you think he would have been given for stealing the church's silver? But the power of forgiveness to change lives. We then find with Valjean's repeated acts of mercy, even toward his enemy Javert. It echoes Christ's teaching on forgiveness and the idea of redemption. The novel centers on the possibility of personal redemption, symbolized by Valjean's life. We also find, in the contrast between Jean Valjean and Inspector Javert, the tension between justice versus mercy. Now we look at Inspector Javert, and you would be hard pressed to find a single thing that he does that is against the law, except in the very end when he lets Jean Valjean off the hook. I mean, that was illegal. He was an officer of the court. He was Inspector Javert. He had an escaped convict right there in his power, and he let him go. Which, as you see the compelling flow of the narrative, is what he should do, what he ought to do. But that's the one break in the law. Other than that, he very rigidly followed the law. Javert embodies a cold, legalistic interpretation of justice, while Valjean represents mercy. And then the idea of suffering and sacrifice. Characters like Fantine and Eponine suffer greatly, reflecting the Christian concept of sacrificial love. Eponine gives her life for Marius in order to protect him. She dies in the altercations at the barricade. Fantine goes into a horrible life in order to provide for her daughter, who was in the care of the Thénardiers. And of course, the care for the poor. We find the great novels of the 19th century often would take note of the plight of the poor. This was especially true in England and in France, where the Industrial Revolution was creating an underclass of people who had been displaced from the agrarian setting, from the farm settings where they had at least eked out an existence. You know, you could be a peasant on a farm and you at least had a chicken to lay eggs, and you had the cow to milk, and you had some, you know, you could go out and dig up a potato from your plot of ground. You could make it. But you're thrown into an urban area and you're a day laborer in a factory. And what do you do if something happens and the factory owner cuts back and all at once you're unemployed and there is no food? Horrible situation. We find in England, Dickens deals with the plight of the poor quite a bit in his novels. And here we find in Les Miserables, Victor Hugo taking up a similar theme. Hugo's portrayal of poverty, inequality, and the corrupt systems of power. They speak to the Christian call to care for the marginalized, aligning with biblical teachings on justice and the dignity of all humans. You need to realize that social structures that had served Europe well for centuries were breaking down. And so the monarchy, the nobility, the things that were the glue that held Europe together for millennia, by the late 17 and into the 1800s, were not working appropriately to care for the people. And there was those plights that were brought out. But those were my notes. Any other observations about the storyline, Jordan? The France, from the fall of the Bourbon monarchy in the 1790s going forward, was in a state of turmoil. And in many ways, it has never quite, I mean, how many, what republic are they on now? Is it the Fifth Republic? They they keep tottering into the most recently in the 1960s. They fell apart and had to completely reconstitute themselves. Um, there is no monarchist sentiment to speak of in France any longer, but that only died out about the turn of the last century, going through the 1800s. Now, they couldn't quite decide what kind of monarch they were going to have, whether it was going to be Napoleonic or Bourbon, but it just, both sides, the monarchist and so many involved with the Catholic Church were only concerned with power, not with the ideals of nobility, the noblesse oblige. And the secularist, having turned against the abuses of the Catholic Church, conflated that with turning against God. And so there was always a very high level of skepticism and atheism on the left with the French. So, Jordan, you're right. It is a recurring theme. And in fact, the rebellion of 1832 was actually a fairly minor one compared with some of the big conflicts that they would have. Anyone else? Mr. Bill.
I think it's interesting that Arius just seemed to get his morals from whomever he's around. He's kind of
he was a college student.
Yeah, so here he is. He's taking on Javert's morals at the end with absolute justice, and the way he's treating Jean Valjean. And then I think you made the sewers smell better when you add the word Parisian.
No, they were definitely the sewers. But on the other hand, bear in mind, the streets of Paris were not all that much better at that time. Oh. Well, thank you all very much. We will be wrapping up there in 2 weeks. We will have Don Quixote, which Landon's going to be presenting for us. Landon actually has translated Don Quixote from Spanish, but I told him he had to keep it all in English for us. Then 2 weeks after that, was what he did as a student. He was a Spanish major.
That's a lot of
That is a lot of translation. Then 2 weeks after that, in keeping with Halloween, I'll be conducting a class on Dracula. Then in November, Jordan will be Killing a Mockingbird. And then in December, Clay will be regaling us with the Lord of the Rings. So we have a lot of good books ahead of us. Thank you all very much, and we will pick up there next time.